Reading is absolutely one of the best things you can do to continue self-guiding your education. But are you reading in a way that actually helps? Let's talk about how you're reading next. Hello and welcome to the Musician Toolkit, episode number 97. My name is David Lane. I'm your host, and it is great to be with you once again. I hope all of you are doing well today. I'm recording this just a few days in advance of the episode coming out, and it is probably the third or fourth day in a row where it truly is fall. It's like I've actually had to get out my jacket and wear it when I'm outside. It is the bluest of blue skies that I see out my studio window, so it is a great day as I'm recording this. This is going to be another short episode. Kind of all of these episodes will be short solo episodes leading up to 100, which is amazingly just 3 episodes away after this one. So today's episode is a loose follow-up to the episode that I released 2 weeks ago, which was episode number 95. And that was, if you are a composer or if you're interested in composition, it's 4 types of books that I recommend. And in addition to the types of books, I recommended the ones that I happen to prefer. And I'm going to rehash the types of books that I recommended, but I'm also going to be talking about a lot of other ones. So today is not for composers, it's for all musicians. It's how you can use reading as a tool to improve, not just who you are as a musician, but who you are as a person, who you are as a teacher. If you are striving to be a professional musician, how you can be a better business person. As I said in the intro, books are absolutely a great way for guiding your self-education. And I don't have all of the articles in front of me, so I can't delve very deep into the science, but there are a lot of papers. There's a lot of research out there that reading something with our eyes, taking our time to kind of process the information on a page, it hits the brain, it hits our learning centers in a different way than, say, hearing someone speak, like on an audiobook or a podcast or a lecture. Not that that's not valuable, so I hope you won't turn me off now. Or watching a video. All of these have their place, and they're all valuable. But there is something about reading, and it's a slow process, and that may have something to do with it. It takes much longer to read most things than it takes to watch or listen to things. But there's something about reading that's just it's very powerful, and it's very worthwhile. And it's one of the things that if you survey the most successful people out there, it's a really high percentage. It's not 100%, but an absurdly high percentage of people take the time to read. Now, when I say that, you might have a number in your head, should I be reading a book a week, 2 books a week? What should my yearly total look like? 50, 100, 150? So that's kind of what I wanted to get to today. And I want to address some of these numbers in just a moment. But I want to first mention some types of books that you might want to consider reading. So to kind of recap what I said 2 weeks ago, but let's add to that list. So I talked about types of theory books, counterpoint, and orchestration. In episode 95, I mentioned 2 types of theory books. But also books on technique for any of the instruments that you're working on, pedagogical books, so books on how to teach. Biographies or memoirs are very good, and it could be of composers, of conductors, of performers. It could be of successful creative people. Believe it or not, I've learned quite a bit about being a professional musician from hearing biographies of people like Chipper Jones, Tom Brady, other athletes. There's some correlation between sports and music. There's correlation between art and music, and even being, an actor in Hollywood. I've read the biographies of Bryan Cranston and Matthew McConaughey and a few others. And every time I read a good biography of someone who's been successful in anything, I learn something, because they'll end up sharing kind of what their practice habits are, and what led them to success. You also get to see how it wasn't all roses. Sometimes it's not the Instagram type career that, you might end up thinking, but you end up hearing about their troubles, about what they had to overcome, and you realize, hey, they're just like me in that regard. So I really highly recommend that you read as many memoirs or biographies of successful people of all kinds that you can. And also music history books. This is a great way to learn about music. But outside of music, I would also recommend that you read psychology books, and you can kind of say self-help if you want to do that as well. But understanding what's driving you, what's going to allow you to succeed, and maybe what's holding you back. There's so many good books out there. If you're a professional musician, or you want to be, you should be reading some business books as well. Because until you think of yourself like a business, you're going to have trouble doing the professional part of being a musician. And then the last thing I thought of is I just called it good fiction, and not to be very snobby about that. I read all kinds of things, some things for enjoyment. I find it very helpful to read some fiction just before I go to bed. And I like reading in the morning as well, and I usually have two different types of books. It just depends on where I am at the time in terms of mood. But I guess what I mean by good fiction is I mean something with either good writing, a good quality of writing, or good character development, or something that has some challenging themes to it. And it doesn't have to be what's called like literary fiction or realistic fiction. There's a lot of very good science fiction books out there that do the same thing. Hey, we're near Halloween, and so one of the books I'm rereading right now, it's my second time, is Skeleton Crew, a short story collection by Stephen King. And, that's just for fun. It's just something I like to have. Keeps me in the mood for, what they call spooky season now. But, even reading some of the stories, there's about once every couple of pages, there's an observation from a character that I want to highlight, I want to take note of. So I hope this kind of inspires you, gives you a lot of ideas of what types of books you can read. But I want to come back to this whole idea of how much should you read. And I want to go ahead and tell you, it really doesn't matter at all. I've been tracking how many books I've read for the longest time. Since 2011. I guess it's not the longest time. I want to go through my year-by-year totals from 2011 to 2019. Per year, starting with 2011, I read 208 books, 223 books, 198 books. 2014, kind of a pedestrian 102 books. But then starting with 2015, 208 books, 295, 344, 197, and 219. And then, 2020 was just weird for everybody. I only read 69 books. But then 2021, 2022, 2023, 197, 160, 105 books. And so far this year, I have read 73 books. I don't think I'll make it to 100 for only the second time since I started tracking. But, I only read 105 last year. Now, when I say read, I'm recording this without video, so you can't see my air quotes. Some people will argue of whether or not listening to an audiobook counts as reading. I do think it does. So probably half of those books, maybe even 60%, are audiobooks, and the rest are ones that I took time to sit down and read. Well, the last time that I had an absurd year, and absurd I would say is 200 plus, I took some time to reflect at the end of the year and realized that there's about maybe 15 or 20 of those books that had any kind of impact on me. And these are ones that I either slowed down or ones that I actually was reading for the second time. And also, I want to go ahead and tell you this, because I've shared my reading years on my personal Facebook page pretty regularly. And I always like to note, what kinds of posts get feedback. Again, not from strangers, but from my friends. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you the number of people who actually care how many books that I read, I can count on one hand. and I don't need to use all my fingers. Truthfully, nobody really cares how many books you read. So if you want to go impress somebody and tell them that you've read 100, 200, 300 books, the only people who care are the ones who are also trying to chase that same number and are looking for something for comparison. And you probably don't know as many people like that as you think. I started noticing that people who are really successful, really that I would call very intelligent, very well informed, their numbers are more like one book a week, or sometimes less than that. I know there's some people who read, maybe one book a month, two books a month. So what I would like to suggest here, and this is something that I've been kind of learning over the last few years and getting better at, is that how many books you read does not matter at all. But the combination of choosing what you read in a way that's going to be helpful to you and your as a person and in your goals, along with how you're reading, makes all the difference. So how can you read in a way that really will make a difference? Well, I'm going to give you 5 suggestions of how you can improve your type of reading. And again, remembering it might be for one book, and I would suggest take one book and start. And if it takes you 2 months to read it, and all you get is 6 books read over the next calendar year, that is success. It's better than not reading, way better than not reading at all, but it's also way better than reading just to check off a number to say that you've read a certain number of books. Okay, so the first approach to reading well, as I said already, just forget quantity, go for quality. So when I say quality, though, I'm not just talking about the type of book you're reading. I'm not just saying, in fact, I'm not saying at all, you should skip all of the pop thrillers and, pop fiction that, may not help you directly. But what I'm saying is what you do choose to read, get the most out of it. Get to where you really know what you're reading. So that's the first step. The second thing that you can do to really improve your experience is, we'll just kind of put it in one category, highlighting and underlining. So if you read off of a Kindle, or I've even used this with my library and the Libby app, you can highlight things. Now, as far as I know with Libby, you need to screenshot what you've highlighted. I don't know a way to save all of the things that you've done. Whereas Kindle, it'll save all of the highlights you've ever done. You can reopen a book. You can go to the highlights section and you can see everything that you've saved. And you can go back to that section to do everything in context. But if you own a book, if you're the type of person that says, "Oh, I don't like to mark up books," if you're going to get more out of your reading experience, you need to reconsider that stance. If you're borrowing someone's book, then you certainly don't want to do that. But if you own the book, you need to mark it up. Now, if you're concerned about how it looks, buy a second copy that's just for display. It's just for cosmetic purposes, and that looks good. But what you're trying to read, what you're trying to get something from, it needs to be something you're willing to mark up, to point out things to yourself that when you come back to it, when you're skimming through pages, you're trying to find something. There it is. You can find your markers. Now I'm one of those. I don't ever want to put any marks in a book that I couldn't erase, so I use pencil. But I'm fine if you want to use an actual highlighter. This is why we call it highlighting. So anytime you read and something strikes you, oh, that's a good idea, or that's a good line, you need to make a note of that. It needs to be something you can come back to again and find it. Even if all you're doing is getting out your phone and taking a picture of that page while you're pointing to the section. But you need to have a way of where you can collect all of these. Right, so that's highlighting and underlining. The third thing that I would recommend, especially if it is a book that you're really trying to learn from, is to have a journal. This could be a section of a notebook or a notebook that's kind of just for this purpose, but write down on a page what the book you're reading is and what chapter you're reading, and just kind of ask this question while you're reading. What does this chapter or this section of a chapter say to me? You could also ask, what can I apply from this? What can I work on right now based on what I just read? And then even sometimes when you're reading fiction, if it's good fiction, sometimes you can ask yourself, what is the one lesson I should take from this? How does this make me feel? So taking a moment to kind of write down your thoughts as you're reading or right after you've read will help you retain more and get more out of what you're reading. So having a journal to go along with your books really helps. The fourth thing that you can do to improve your reading experience is specifically with the music books. So talking about music history, theory, counterpoint, orchestration, techniques, and even like biographies of composers. If there is music that is mentioned, I highly, highly, highly recommend listening to any piece of music that is mentioned or playing along if it's a piece you can play on your instrument. If you have the written score, follow along. So I've done this several times. I read a 2-part biography of Igor Stravinsky by Stephen Walsh. Very good 2-volume set. The first volume is called A Creative Spring, Russia and France, and it covers his birth, 1882, all the way to the years 1934. And then the second volume is The Second Exile, France and America, 1934 to 1971. And every time it mentioned a piece, and it mentioned all of them, I read them. And for the very few pieces he wrote that it didn't really mention, well, one of the appendices is a full timeline of everything he wrote. So I took time to listen to it. If I had the score or I was able to find the score, I followed along and, occasionally even made some notes on the score. So, it took me a while to do that. It took me even taking a good bit of time per day. I think it was probably 3 or 4 months that I took on this particular book. Now, that was in the evenings primarily. I took the mornings to kind of, be reading regularly some other things. And of course, I usually have an audiobook, playing at some point. But I got so much more out of Stravinsky's biography by hearing the music that he wrote in order and studying it as I can, instead of just reading the words. I also did this with a couple of music history books. One is called The Classical Style by Charles M. Rosen. A very difficult book with kind of academic flowery language from the 1960s, I believe, that really focuses intensely on Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and why these are the 3 composers among the many from that time period that we highlight as being representative of the classical style. While we, maybe we ignore composers like Hummel, Clementi, Czerny, Boccherini, and so many other composers from this period. It's a very difficult book, but so many pieces are cited, and I took time to listen to each one of them as it was mentioned before I went on with the book. And again, it took a long time, but I got so much out of that. And then Alex Ross's book that I've mentioned multiple times on this podcast called The Rest is Noise, Listening to the Music of the 20th Century. Well, that is an interesting book if you just read it, but it is an outstanding book if you take time to listen. Now, I'm almost done with my 40s, but I'm going to go ahead and say that if you are at least 40 years old or older, you ought to be able to appreciate being in high school or being in college or of college age. And if you wanted to listen to anything, you had to go find someone who had the album, borrow it from a library, or buy it yourself, whether it be LP, cassette, CD, whatever it is. You had to have the music physically. Now, before we get to episode 100, I'm going to say a few things about Spotify and streaming music. Just a few personal thoughts. And I know that it's a controversial subject among some of you, but it's there. And having streaming music is really invaluable to just be able to play absolutely anything that you're searching for, whether it's YouTube or Spotify or Apple Music, Amazon Music, whatever your platform is. I highly recommend taking advantage of when you're reading something, go find that piece right then, right there, and listen to it. And then the fifth and final thing that I would recommend to improve your reading experience is rereading. chances are you will not get the most out of what you're reading the very first time you do it. If you read it and you think to yourself, this is really good, I got a lot out of it, or if you think, well, this was good, there's a lot there, but I don't know that I got all of it. In either of those scenarios, you should definitely put it on your to reread list. And I would say that sooner is better than later. Now, if there's a book that you really enjoy, that you really get a lot out of, putting it on a kind of a every other year schedule of getting to is not a bad idea. But what I would say is the books that you really are trying to get a lot out of, I would read it again right away or soon. There's a book, probably going to be the best book that I read of 2024. I read it early this year. It's called What to Say When You Talk to Yourself by Shad Helmstetter. I listened to it as an audiobook. And although, as I said, that's probably not the best way to consume a book, it was really more of a inspirational, kind of almost listening to like a podcast episode. But immediately when I was done, because it was like a 5 or 6 hour audiobook, which is, if you're not into audiobooks, that's not very long. I had it checked out for 3 weeks. It took me about 2 or 3 days to listen to it, so I immediately listened to it again. And then I started journaling at night things that I was getting out of the book, especially that second time. And because of that, even though I read it over 6 months ago, I still remember very completely just about everything from that book that I wanted to get out of it. And of course, I plan to read it again a little bit later on, but I read it twice in about probably a little over a week, maybe 10 days. And that really helped. I don't think I would have gotten much out of that if I had just read it once. So rereading can help. Now, another technique, I've never done this, but I've thought about doing it. So you might want to try this as well. If you know that you plan on reading a book more than once, you might try, now I probably wouldn't do this with fiction, but about maybe anything else, try reading each chapter twice before you go on to the next chapter. So read chapter 1, read chapter 1 again, and then go to chapter 2 and read it again. Now, if you do all of this, you're not going to read very many books in a year. If you want to experience quantity, then what I would suggest is that you fill the rest of your time with books that are just for pleasure. But if you want to be a growing artist, a growing musician, you should always have at least one book active that you're regularly reading in this way of quality that is helping you to grow. But it doesn't have to be the only type of reading that you do. But, you might be the type of person that says, I really don't like reading that much. I still recommend that you do everything that we've talked about, and then you don't have to read anything else. It might be that you're going to talk about the 3, 4, 5, 6 books a year that you've read, and that's going to be good if those books really meant something to you. So again, some approaches that you can add to help yourself read better. Just in summary, forget about quantity, go for quality, not just the type of book you're reading, but your experience with reading it. Second thing is make use of highlighting and underlining in any way of marking something that you got out of a book as you were reading it. The third thing is consider journaling, writing down thoughts about a chapter or section after you've read it or as you're reading it, and asking yourself questions. What can I apply? What does this chapter or section say to me? What is the one lesson that I should take from this and apply right now? The fourth thing, specific to books that talk about music, is you should be listening or playing along or following along in the score every time you come to such a piece. It'll really slow you down, but it'll really help you understand the music. And I forgot to mention with that, but if you're reading a theory book and it's giving you some examples, you should go to the piano and play those examples. And then lastly, take time to reread right away or soon, and you may even consider reading each chapter twice before you go on to the next. So that is going to wrap up episode number 97. If you got something out of this episode, I would greatly appreciate it if you would share it with someone who can benefit from this episode. And just want to thank you for taking time to listen. And if you are listening to this episode on YouTube, please click the like on this video. Feel free to leave me a comment. It's actually my previous episode. Someone left me a comment asking to report on how I'm doing as I start learning the organ, because I talked about how that's something I need to do for my new church job. And I said, well, that might be a good idea for maybe a quarterly report. Probably not a featured episode, but it might be something I'll talk about what I'm doing to get better and how that's going. So again, every bit of feedback helps. I greatly appreciate it. Greatly appreciate you taking time to listen to this in the sea of podcasts that's out there. So one last time, thank you for listening, and I'll be back with you again next week.